So I think for now, I was trying to imagine how I would go through this study, but I think there'll probably be layers and layers. So in the approach that I usually take, where I just kind of talk through it, I think that's what I'm going to do. I'm kind of in between things, and so I don't have my references in front of me, so I'm just going to try to explain a little bit as to what I'm gathering from this study. And I'm not really committed to this yet. It's just, like I said, I intended to do something else, and then I kind of got drawn into this, and so it seems really interesting, and I'm kind of just on the surface of it, and so we'll just kind of go through, talk through it. So in reference to, or kind of drawing upon those previous videos that I had posted, they explain, and so a lot of interpretations explain it this way, that the focus on Israel eventually becomes a sense of like a influence within the story that seems to make reference to this uniqueness of God in reference to a transformative approach to the surrounding nations and a type of preference and whatnot. I'm not necessarily denying that there's some type of unique aspect of the story in reference to what eventually becomes known as Israel. As much as when you start looking at some of the other storylines, you start seeing that something else seems to be going on there. Because initially they're not directed or guided by Israel. And seems to be this other aspect generating influence that they then have to strategize. Then when you start looking at this, you start to possibly realize that, yes, Israel eventually becomes this kind of central figure in this whole sequence of whatever transformative thing is occurring here. But then it becomes peculiar, right? Because Israel also involves itself into what seems contrary to God. Even when people look at like the 10 Commandments and these ideals that people are supposed to like shift toward, and they just seem to be another version of another conquest conflict. But then we're supposed to think it's unique unto God. And so then it ends up being these interpretations that people try on and try to make it fit and what's going on there and whatnot. Even to the point then where some people suggest, this just doesn't seem like God. This seems like one of the ancient gods. This seems like another one of those like ancient warfare conquest stories. And even in some versions where you read the overview, it kind of reads like that. When you're not told to think of it as a better version of God or the ultimate version of God, it does kind of read as just another conquest story, another ancient story told in reference to a certain group to make them seem like they're the good guys and the other guys are the bad guys. And they do similar things, and they fight similar battles, they have similar supremacy type ideologies. Something about it then starts to feel a little bit, when you're looking at the storyline, like hypocritical, right? And then it makes you ponder, like, okay, there seems to be things held in tension here where there does seem to be something transformative about this story, something kind of unique. And then something just very much like I was saying, the same order of conquest and storylines that suit your version of conquest, or competing historic revisions of sorts, like a lot of groups do. So anyway, when you're approaching the story and you're trying to kind of pull back from that a little bit and not thinking or assuming initially that everything is acceptable and everything is like a reflection of God, and you're thinking, wait, what else is going on here? Because eventually it does seem transformative. It does seem different, like when we start seeing characters later on and like the Jesus character and whatnot, transforming some of the claims and approaches. But then still, there's these unresolved conflicts, and has to do with some of these stories and the conquest and what's going on there. What's going on with Israel in relation to the land of Canaan and God and the surrounding nations and whatnot. So one of the things that I started to imagine, what it seems like, is that throughout the whole storyline, it talks about Cain, or makes reference to Cain, and then all the way through, and this is what I mentioned in the first video, Cain and the blood, right? The blood spilt on the land, and then it eventually turns into these evil interactions and tensions in reference to this blood, right? There's even references where it seems to suggest, and I'll have to look these up and kind of confirm this, but in reference to not just Canaan, but some of the influence, like the religious influence there eventually, seems to suggest that the region becomes referenced as like the city of blood. And so, as I was saying, I don't have my references, and I was going to look this up more, but I'm just going to talk through it. And so it comes across as like the reference is known, or maybe seem to be known to them as the city of blood. And the reference of influence seems to be this, like, these blood connotations. So along those lines, it starts to seem to read as though a lot of strategies, if there's going to be some sort of longevity or transformative aspect, seems ruled in some sense by the blood accounts or the spilled blood, and the aspect of stages of the curse that it seems to bring out. And so it seems to read along the lines of these unresolved curses, this spilt blood, this untransformed interaction between various ones, and then certain stages of transgression for there to be a hope to intervene, to be transformative. So along those lines, it doesn't seem like it's just this inserted, like full representation of God's divine intervention being fully manifest. You find that because of this, and then those that adhere to this stage of strategizing the blood accounts, no matter who it is, whether it be those eventually later within the connotation of Israel, and then those that associate themselves with it, which are many, that, or, you know, I mean, many in the sense of many that become known as Israel is this mixture of groups. It's not just like a pure ethnic preservation of things. There's various ones that contribute to what eventually becomes the increase of this strategy, gauging the times and whatnot. Along these lines, what you also find is that this whole interaction becomes really complex, and it seems to select for either those that learn to play into this path of God in terms of the blood accounts, or those that either adhere to where the path of the blood accounts are, but also seem to pick up on something that has to do with not just manufacturing or interacting based on blood accounts, but a certain type of characteristic of those that would go beyond the blood accounts, and then that which speaks to attributes that prevent them in the first place. And so then over time there becomes this sense of like little increments of a transformative value, and then also seeking the power of conflict, gauging conflict. And the error when conflict becomes too egotistical where then it surrenders people into this whole different dominion of things. So then there's all of these things that seem to go on. And as I was saying, throughout the story, there's various ones. So generally, what it had seemed to be in the past was that the references between who was good and who was bad was generally dividing these certain sides. And looking at these certain sides of conquest and whatnot, instead of, as I was saying, recognizing how it was selecting from those within it to adhere to this transformative value, this transformative work that was going on. And in retrospect, it also seems to read as though when the blood accounts would kind of run their course, there would be certain things that would happen to certain systems, and they would then concur that this was God doing these things and not really looking at the effects of their interactions, eventually creating a precarious system and then them being like surrendered into it. And so then when it would get to those points, there would be this tendency to be at odds with God as opposed to transformative ways of living and looking at what is precarious about systems, what inevitably falls no matter who does it. And so we start finding that in the story that actually the sides, or the tendency to create these sides in and of themselves, didn't really have the power. They would fall. Their attempts to build their own power, to get caught up in their own power, would erode and collapse as well. And then there would be remnants, right? So that's what it seems like we start to see in the story, is this distinctive aspect of, in the midst of conflict and turmoil, there was these other portions of just starting to set aside where people would recognize a transformative way to go about it. In and of that, then, eventually, a transformative way to view God or understand God, and not just in these types of blood account powers that were breaking through systems. Why does this matter, right? To seem to recognize this, if this is the case in how some of the story reads. And I think it's of tremendous significance in that it doesn't just give this aspect of Israel being magically favored in that sense, but that there's this almost type of formula going on that even Israel falls into and stumbles within, and then God's correcting. And this certain path, this certain aspect of things going on. I think for the most part, people would concur with that when you read the rest of Scripture. But there's still this question, though, even in the midst of it. There's this question as to, like, even if what was God doing with Canaan, though? In the midst of the guidance or what they're to adhere to or make reference to is this question of Canaan and what was going on with God in Canaan. So this is where it gets interesting, where you start looking at what it seemed to be that Noah and Abraham and various ones still believed, is that even though there were excesses in belief and idolatry and stuff like that, it seemed like they were still very much a product of the times. They seemed to understand or gauge that there was some type of power influence in reference to the blood accounts or the ruling powers maintaining burnt offerings and sacrifices and things like that. But even in reference to trying to abide by it, seemingly by its protocol, it seemed that it was still causing groups to morph into these conflicts and not really being connected to God, and not really being free from the tensions and the maintenance and the managing of these systems, right? See this with examples possibly with like Job, where he's seen as righteous. He's trying to manage the moral compass of things and be right with God, and he's offering these burnt offerings and whatnot. You also see later, after the flood, Noah is trying to appease God by offering these burnt offerings and stuff like that. And then it's read as though like it's so pleasing to God, like the aroma and whatnot. So that's where like people, and even Abraham does this, right? And then even Abraham believes that God wants him possibly to offer his son. So they're very much in that consciousness. But they also seem to have this aspect of like something else seems to be going on though. Like God is kind of transitioning us to be in these like alternative positions to the powers. And but then this is, I think, where when people read these stories, they think this just sounds like those ancient, stories where there's sacrifice and powers, like the ancient Canaanite gods or Babylonian gods and stuff like that. And actually it does seem very much like that. And when you start comparing these old stories, you do find that there's a lot of similarities in that language and those stories and whatnot. And the story very much draws upon a lot of those symbolisms, but it's supposed to be suggested that it's ultimately transformative, though. So this is where it kind of takes a little bit of a turn in what I'm trying to work out in reference to how Canaan is actually used in the story. And so instead of this notion where God is ridding Canaan, as we often seem to have it interpreted, it seems as though in the story, it might be that God's actually using Canaan through which to critique the power of Babel or to transform it in some ways. And that it almost seems to read as though the mechanism of this conflict isn't really relieved until possibly after Christ. And then that's why it says later that there had been a better testimony to the blood that was spilt rather than the blood that was spilt of Abel, which is Cain. And then these like connections to Canaan and whatnot. So I mean, there is still a transformative aspect of what was occurring there, but it seems to carry through as still being this type of reference to Canaan and the lands and Cain and whatever that original transformative work was. This is where it becomes interesting, where it doesn't seem to read as though Israel is that which replaces Canaan, but becomes a different type of Canaanite and has a different approach of entering into the very mechanisms of what Canaan was and inserting a transformative interaction there that none of them were really immune to. That they were all kind of caught in this system of Babel and transitioning it. And so that's what I was kind of looking at and pondering. And so I guess to start unpacking some of that, I don't know if I should start with Abraham and like work backwards. So I think what people are usually pretty familiar with is there's a story of Cain and then the error and then the transition to Seth, which is the son that replaces Abel that was killed, and then Noah, and then Shem, and then through Shem then there's Abraham, and then through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then that whole lineage of Israel in the land of Canaan. It seems like you kind of find is that this main point that starts out in Genesis is this Tower of Babel, this power system that reaches to the heights and seeks to reach to the heavens, right? And seems to be this place of God that's in competition to God in so many ways. So it seems to suppose, or maybe it's like probability or something, that the general tendency is that Babel will tend to reach its height of power and encapsulate people in it. Even if it's dispersed, it'll regather and regenerate that power, and then disperse and then regenerate that power. And so it seems to be this type of story where they're seeing this pattern or recognizing the power of it and internally having to separate and scatter to some degree to transform it. And so it's this really long story where eventually they are back in Babylon. And it's that power structure again. And then it sets up this whole long stage of a transformative work. And then we see that through Christ and whatnot. What I started to seem to notice is, and this is where it's like a question mark. Like I haven't really thoroughly worked through all of this. So back to the story where there's this question of Noah, right? Noah and then his sons and then Abraham. It seems like it's not that God is just working through Seth and then creating Cain as the enemy. What it seems like is the framework of Adam and Eve was intending to be a redemptive interaction. There was like maybe a blessing on them of sorts. And then they got drawn into this corruption. And that then their sons, of whom you would assume they loved both of them, were a part of this, what then was it even further redemptive attempt, because they had corrupted the calling and then they were pushed out of the garden and whatnot. What also seems peculiar about it is that after they're pushed out of the garden and there's this error, it's almost as though they're losing ground, right? Or they're like losing ground and literally losing ground, because then the ground is cursed. There's this sense where they're pushed out and they're supposed to, in a sense, be out in the field and working the soil and resisting this other connection, right? This other improper connection to the gods or what have you. And so then there's that whole account with Cain and Abel. There seems to be something peculiar there. I'll resist unpacking it too much or thinking about it too much. But, I mean, so what's difficult about it is there's already other commentary on it after the fact, where people already assume it's just like a pure good and evil thing with Cain and Abel. And so most of the commentary seems to suggest that Cain was intending for evil and doing evil and whatnot. And who knows, maybe he was, and I'm not really committed to one side or the another in that sense, as much as I'm just trying to like look at the story a little bit differently and kind of pull myself out of the framework as to how it's generally interpreted. But there's this sense where, let's see, how do I kind of unpack this at least a little bit? There's this sense that if you kind of stand back and you think like that wasn't supposed to happen with Cain and Abel. That wasn't supposed to happen. And he's still on their side, I guess you would say. So if you're looking at different sides, there seems to be possibly Adam and Eve are in this structure. There's already a system around them. It seems like maybe powers or lords or whatnot. And they're in this garden and they're brought into this like situation where the hope is that they would understand the direction of God, but then they kind of get caught up in this stuff and they fall into error. And then the ground is cursed, right? There's a split between what seems to be a connotation of a responsibility of the man to work the soil, and the soil is cursed, and so by the sweat of his brow and through this like painful toil, he'll work the ground and have to find sustenance and stuff like that. And then through the seed of the woman is supposed to be this redemptive offspring that will then be a part of freeing them and whatnot. So they're still kind of in this situation where they're still hoping that their movement or whatever it is has redemptive value. And so they're all basically kind of on the same team, I guess you would say. And then this thing happens with Cain and Abel. Actually so it's kind of strange, because if you imagine, so try this on for a moment, that they're actually in a dominion. They're in a dominion and there's already a type of lord And there's this expectation of these certain types of interaction, because what you see later is through their attempts at redemption, they interact with this and they try to straighten their lives out and make amends and then offer burnt offerings. Because there's even this reference to Noah later, that he's a man of the soil, like similar to Cain, I believe. He's a man of the soil, and after the flood, he's trying to make amends to God, and he offers these like burnt offerings. And so it's kind of reminiscent of him doing the thing that maybe was how Cain and Abel were split, where he's a man of the soil and then he's offering these burnt offerings and whatnot. And so it makes you wonder, like, was Abel supposed to be offering these burnt offerings? Is this really attributed to God, or is it the dominion at the time? Is it the dominion that is functioning as Lord over them, and they believe it? It's the consciousness that they're in. And maybe to some degree there is something to it, because they kind of have to manage the signs of the times in reference to the powers. Either way, there's a lot more analysis that can go into like what was actually going on there with like Cain and Abel, because it doesn't seem like they should have been required to have to do all the burnt offerings and whatnot. And there was this like tension in relation to working the soil and the system that they were caught up in and whatnot. But anyway, there is that conflict. And so what's interesting when I was rereading the story, at least in the interpretation that I had, was it says something like when Cain falls into this conflict with his brother, so I do think it means more than what it seems like. There must have been some kind of like system stuff going on there, some type of adherence. Could have even been that Cain was feeling the tension of the dominion, and there was this tension of the gods, because what they're ultimately supposed to be doing was finding that level of freedom, or at least that was the hope in terms of the whole storyline, is like a redemption from those dominions, right? I mean, some accounts though read as though, I feel like they, and maybe this is correct or maybe it's not correct, but they impose things on Cain afterwards when he's supposed to be, the bad guy and whatnot. It does seem like they add stuff to it, but it seems like that comes after the fact, when that's already how people are reading the story. But it's not even to like gloss over him either and then turn him into this like pierced character either. There seems to be a tension that they all live in, where none of them are really in this transformed system and freedom. They have to manage all of these things and whatnot, and they're caught up in this system where there's like turmoil, and they have to work the ground and all of these things and whatnot. So when you're not trying to make him out to automatically be a villain, because he's part of their group, they're supposed to all be in this together, and then it breaks into these tensions. Then you see then that the other aspect of God that is being revealed through them protects Cain. And to rewind for a minute, what's also interesting is when you read the story, because they come out of the curse, because what I was doing is I was looking at the sections of curses. So there's the curse in the Garden of Eden, after they eat from the tree, the forbidden fruit and whatnot, then the ground is cursed, and by the sweat of their brow they have to work the ground and whatnot. And then there's like the curse between the woman's offspring and the serpent and whatnot. And what you find is what happens with Cain is that it says something to the effect of like, Cain, what have you done? Your brother's blood cries out from the ground, and and I'm paraphrasing here, when his blood soaked into the ground and that blood came up and it reached your hand, now you're cursed. And so it seems interesting that the curse that Cain gets is because when he shed the blood connected him to him. He was cursed because the ground was cursed, and now he's cursed because the blood is spilt on the ground. And so I was kind of looking at that, and because it says something, this is why I was saying I don't have like the references with me, because it says something to the effect of curse being something to the effect of part of the aspect of the curse on the ground was that it wouldn't be or that the curse would be on them until they're brought to the dust or something to that, almost like until they go and like till they die or something to that effect. It seems to portray possibly that when he killed somebody, it reamped the curse, because then the curse generated through the spilt blood, because he didn't just die and return to dust, he was murdered. And so his blood spilling into the cursed ground, it says like came up and like connected that curse to Cain's hand or hands. And so then along those lines, then that curse regenerates through Cain. And so then Cain is like, or then God's like, what have you done? Now you're cursed. And so they kind of have this back and forth of like, I can't handle this. Like, how am I cursed? There has to be, you know, almost like there needs to be something redemptive about this. And they're going to kill me now. And so it kind of gets into this like, now they're going to kill me and this and that and the other thing. And then, so then God says, like kind of forbid it. I'll put a mark on Cain so that anybody that kills him will be cursed, you know, or something to that effect, or like entering into this like times whatever. But then what you find is that even if that's supposed to be like alleviating it, and like now you have to live out your days and you have to wander, and the ground will no longer like bear fruit for you. You'll have to wander and do all of these other things. You end up finding that, so he's kind of thrown out, right? So Cain is like thrown out to wander. And then you find that then he has this genealogy where he develops and he has children. And he kind of like seems to live in this tumult. And it's kind of a short summary of Cain's interaction in scripture. But if you look at other accounts, and I kind of take it with a grain of salt, I was kind of reading through Josephus. You can kind of see, though, that Josephus is influenced by other opinions and, like, later accounts. And so, like I said, you have to take it with a grain of salt, that it kind of can give you a little bit of an idea of what people were talking about. But you can't take it as, like, full, like, in my opinion, like, everything that he says is correct. You when you read it, you can see that he has influence of how certain scholars or people would interpret it. But you do kind of get other opinions about what seemed to be going on with the story when you read like Josephus and connections to like Cain, or like Cain, the children of Noah and whatnot. What I'm trying to get to is this peculiar aspect where it doesn't seem like Cain's contribution goes away. There seems to be this protective aspect where the work that God, if you want to look at it as God, was doing with them, he didn't totally abandon it. Because Cain was their only offspring, and it was the redemptive work that was going to be done through them. And so there's this long period of time where Cain then goes on to have more children, and eventually it seems like alongside times where it seems to have connotation, making reference to conflict and tension and other hostilities happening, because there's this character within Cain's lineage, Lamech, that says something like basically like someone was threatening him. He got into this like conflict, and he ended up taking the life of somebody, and there's no way to really appease it. And so he proclaims, like in this like kind of lineage of Cain, he says something like, if Cain is I forget the exact word, But basically, like, if Cain is covered by this fault, then I'm also covered by this times 70 or something like that. It's said differently, but it's something to that effect. Like, by certain generations. We generally, when we read these things, we assume that they're like villains and that they were caught up in this hostility. And it could be. Or it could be that what they're saying is that they're caught up in these situations of conflict and possibly in self-protection, or maybe what they deem self-protection, they take someone's life. And then there's nothing really that can fully appease them of that. And so it makes them caught up in this, like, they're generating these blood accounts. They're caught up in, and it's making them susceptible possibly to the quote-unquote gods and the ruling powers. And so then what you find is what seems to be in the story. So this is where I think people look at it as Cain's lineage became corrupt, and then they had to wait until Adam had another child. And then through Seth, then there was like the redemptive connection to Noah. But I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, I don't think that's what it seems to be saying. If Cain just kind of was blotted out and there was no connection there anymore, then they could have just said, like, Cain's lineage faded out because they were corrupt and evil. And then Adam and Eve had another child, and so it carried forth through this other child. But it doesn't. It kind of has this weird connection where there seems to be these similarities, and people say they're different genealogies, and, you know, maybe they are. Maybe they are, but then you get this connection with Seth. And what it kind of seems to read as is the reason that it carries on Cain's lineage is because it seems to be portraying the time of transgressions, similar to other patterns that we see throughout the rest of, like, other times in scripture where there's certain systems, they go through this stage of sin, and then they have to go through generations of alleviating the transgressions. And that makes them susceptible to the gods. And so when the blood is spilt, they become susceptible, enslaved, if you will, or something to that effect, to the gods. Because at that time, the gods seemed to have obtained rule in place of God through possibly like spilt blood and the managing of spilt blood. Maybe in ancient times, they tapped into understanding the gauging of the times through things like that. But even if they were tapping in through gauging of the times, as I was saying before, they weren't always understanding a transformative value of a different system to not only alleviate the blood accounts, but to alleviate just individual characters built in more of the spirit and revelation of God. They were living to like manage it under these dominions and whatnot. So then what it seems like is the reason why possibly that it talks about Cain's lineage is because it's talking about the stage of transgression, as though God's not done with him yet through that lineage or whatever that was initiated. And so it seems like it compares Cain's lineage or genealogy next to Seth's, as though Cain's lineage became caught up with the gods and it had to run through transgressions. And then there was the time of Seth, which then it says was like almost like a reemergence of the stage of Adam. Someone once again reaching almost like the stage where the transgressions have run their course, the return to the stage of Adam again, in the likeness of Adam. So then you get this stage of Seth and this the genealogy. And then eventually that, through long period of time, is what develops the stage of Noah. And there's these strange connotations where when you look at the genealogy of Cain and Seth at the same time, Cain possibly caught up with like adherence to the gods because of these blood accounts. And Seth representing the stage, possibly running the course, reaching the stage of maybe reaching transgression, where there's another stage of Adam, like the Adam, which is man, reaching the stage of man, which is kind of a similar connotation to what we had seen in the garden, where Adam was created. So if you look at Genesis 1, there seems to be the stage of a different type of creation where they're ruling. And then chapter 2, I believe it is, where it talks about in the midst of that creating Adam, which then through Adam has this other connection to Eve, and through them is regenerating this different type of connection, which seems to be a connotation of man in relation to the gods. And so it almost seems like, because you see this pattern throughout scripture, where when there's a dominion built, there's a stage of the rulers and the stage of those who work the ground, work the soil or what have you. And that's what eventually Noah says. He says he's something to the effect he's the man that works the soil. And then eventually, to appease, he offers the burnt sacrifices. So it's he's doing the Cain and Abel thing. But what it seems like is it could be that during that time, there was still interaction between the lineage of Cain and the lineage of Seth. And it could be through the daughters, through their different daughters, through the sons, through the daughters. And it does kind of seem like it reads as though, because in the next part after Noah, because it talks about reaching the stage of Noah, and that Noah, what it says about Noah is that something to the effect of that he would be the one that would free them from the cursed ground, or something of the curse of the ground and the curse of their hands. And if they are making reference to the cursed ground and their cursed hands, they're talking about Cain, the curse of Cain. And so then it makes it seem as though they all became susceptible to the curse of Cain, that was cursed from the ground and cursed from his hands because of the blood that touched his hands. And so they say this thing about they finally seem to reach this stage where somebody from the lineage can have a transformative approach, and that's Noah, that can relieve them from the curse of the ground and the curse of the hands, or something to that effect. But there's this differentiation that has to happen, because in the midst of that distinction developing, other groups became really corrupt, because there's a lot of different ones involved. There's a lot of different systems built and whatnot. And it almost seems like, and this is just a side note, because I always thought this was kind of bizarre, even years ago when I was reading through these, and I was like, why are there such similarities between Cain and Seth's genealogy? Even though people always say, well, that's not the same Enoch, that's not the same, what is his name? Is it Lamech or something like that? These aren't the same characters, which I'm not saying that they are the same, but it kind of makes me wonder, because there's other places in scripture where it seems like when they use similar names, that it almost seems like the names mean themes. The names mean a stage of sequence in the season, or the theme, or something going on. And so I'm pondering, because there's some associations with Enoch seeming to be a positive connotation, and then stages of Lamech, is it Lamech? I'm forgetting now. Being a negative connotation, where transgressions are incorporated, And so it kind of makes me wonder if those are times where they intersected too, where this different lineages were intersecting, where there were some positive things about Cain's lineage and some negative things about it. And then there was some positive, negative things about Seth's lineage, and there was times where it was interweaving. And so then that's when, among that tension, then there's Noah, and he's this distinction, right? He's this distinction after this runs the course of the seeming transgressions or something. And then it says that through Noah, then God does this separate thing, because everyone had a majority of the dominion or the system had become so corrupt. And so then the stage is the story of Noah. And then it talks about the inclinations of man's heart being evil, and the son, like the children of the gods and the children of man, started to intermingle and interweave to the point where they weren't discerning the distinction of God until they got to the stage of Noah. And then Noah and his family were going to be the ones to break forward into the next stage of things. And I was reading that and I was thinking, it does seem like it's talking about them. Like the way the story reads seems like it's saying they didn't delete Cain. He was still part of the story. He was incorporated. It seems like he was incorporated into Cain's lineage and Seth's lineage, like interwove. The Cain was in reference to being kind of enslaved through the blood accounts unto the gods, or maybe had even adhered to that connection. And Seth was supposed to be that which brings forth the distinction of man, like in the image of Adam, to restore the ground and whatnot. And then that's what you get as their hope after this with Noah. And so Noah seems to be a representation of both the lineage of Cain and Seth. So this is where, like, I haven't done a lot of the background stuff, but I did watch a few videos, and some people suggest, like, there's some groups that seem to suggest that Noah, like, different ones of their daughters and different ones had married various ones, and that was like intermarriage. That people, there's a lot of different suggestions to it. Some seem to suggest that that Noah married from Cain's lineage. I think I'm going to leave it there for now. There's more to talk about, but I'll just kind of leave this in this like rough notes of an introduction to this question mark, thinking about Cain and Seth and their lineage, and then the stage of Noah, and then what happens there with Noah, as instead of separating from Cain, being the distinction of incorporating Cain and Seth, because it had to go through its transgressions, as I was saying, and then it reached the stage of a transformative occurrence going on there.